Good afternoon. Here we are again. This is the third lecture in History 1302.3, 2303.0, Texas Survey of Texas History. We talked last time about Spain's problems of trying to establish itself and protect Spain's interests in New Spain, the lands taken as a result of Christopher Columbus's voyages of discovery. One should note that relative to our list of class terms, and forgive me while I'm fumbling with my class terms, we acknowledge that Spain had an opportunity very early on to establish missions and presidios throughout its empire in the New World. But the truth is that in 1776, the northern provinces of Spain, New Spain, were designated the interior provinces, or provincias internas, under a commandant general directly responsible to the Spanish king. And that meant that after 1776, the Spanish military essentially ruled Texas through the king, quite independent of the viceroy. The problem with that is that Spain's rule in Texas never was very effective. For instance, some officers neglected their troops and took advantage of their men. For instance, Governor Martos y Navarrete, governor from 1759 to 1767, was accused of making an $80,000 profit by selling military supplies to his own men at Los Andes. And even earlier, in 1737, the captain in charge of the La Bahia Presidio, the Spanish fort at La Bahia at Goliad, was reprimanded by the Spanish governor for failure to adequately pay and supply and clothe his own men. And that same commandant at La Bahia had once been the same commandant of the Rockdale Xavier mission, who was accused of killing a priest, but charges were eventually dropped against him. In terms of civil life in Spanish Texas, in 1731, 55 Canary Islanders were relocated to San Antonio, and that helped the city to grow. By 1770, there were 800 citizens in San Antonio, and landowners elected an ayuntamiento. An ayuntamiento was a sort of city council, and they selected an alcalde. An alcalde is a position in Spain that combined the jobs of mayor, sheriff, and justice of the peace. By 1770, Bexar became the actual capital of Spanish Texas, and certainly after 1776, when Los Andes was abandoned, officially San Antonio became the provisional seat of Spanish Texas. There was a 1780 census that was taken in Spanish Texas, and 45% of the population was female, 50% male, and a quarter to a third of those in the census were not adults; they were adolescents. Widows and widowers constitute about 10% of the population of Spanish Texas. The chief occupation was ranching and the raising of livestock. In fact, Texans were so efficient at raising livestock that by 1803, about 50,000 head of cattle a year were smuggled into American Louisiana and traded for goods there, because goods were cheaper in Louisiana than those brought overland from Spanish Texas, into Spanish Texas from Veracruz, Mexico. The people of New Spain remained Catholic, and there were only a few missionaries by By 1785, there were only 9 priests in all of Texas. Rules and regulations governed the people's lives, but the rules and regulations weren't oppressive, because the truth is there were few officials to make sure that the laws were being followed. Spanish Texas remained isolated and primitive and civilized only in pockets of such as Nacogdoches and San Antonio and Goliad, etc. So conditions were pretty primitive in Spanish Texas. That was particularly true looking at the next list of terms, history terms 2. That was particularly going to be true after the acquisition of Louisiana by the United States in 1803 by Mr. Jefferson. But even before that, Spain had come to the conclusion that holding on to her territories in the New World was going to be very difficult. A gentleman by the name of the Marquis de Ruby was appointed by the Spanish King Charles in the 1760s, to inspect the interior provinces of New Spain from 1766 to 1769. The Marquis de Ruby traveled from Spanish Louisiana all the way to California, the Gulf of California. While in Texas, he visited all the Spanish settlements of note. And when Ruby reported to the Viceroy, he reported that he doubted that the East Texas post could be maintained, given how far away from the interior of New Spain they were. And as a result, a royal order in September the 10th of 1772 called for, as applied to Texas, 1, the Spaniards were going to abandon all missions and presidios in East Texas and consolidate in San Antonio and at La Bahia in Goliad. Secondly, the Spanish would strengthen Bear, the city of San Antonio, by moving the East Texas settlers away from East Texas to San Antonio. And 3, the Spanish in September of 1772 inaugurated a peace program with the Comanche Indians and decided to wage a war of extermination against the Apaches. The most difficult of all was the forced relocation of the East Texas settlements, an enforcement task that was given over to Texas Governor Baron Ripperda. 500 Spanish citizens were forcibly removed to San Antonio. Soon, these displaced citizens of Spain petitioned to return to Los Aires, where their leader, Antonio Gil y Barbeau, had a substantially large ranch. The refugees moved eastward as far as they could, as the Viceroy of Spain, New Spain, would allow, and they created the community of Bucareli in August of 1774. By 1777, Bucareli had 347 citizens, but floods and Comanche Indian raids forced an unauthorized move to Nacogdoches in 1779. And indeed, some of the settlers went right back into their old houses that they had occupied before the decision was made to relocate them. So that is the start of Nacogdoches, Texas. The Indian policy was to be executed by Ananthius de Mezieres, the lieutenant governor of the Natchitoches district. In 1771, he made peace with the Wichita Indians, and in 1772 opened up negotiations with the Tavavoyas near Waco. Then in 1774 he signed a treaty with the Nakona Comanche, but other Comanches continued annually to harass San Antonio. For years, Mezieres worked with Ripperda on what he called an Apache solution to eradicate the Apaches, but Mezieres died before a military campaign could begin. The truth is, with just 200 Spanish soldiers in all of Texas, it was impossible to conquer even the Apaches. temporary truces with the Apache in 1749 and with the Comanches in 1774 and 1785 helped. But Ripperda and his successors, Domingo Cabela and Manuel Munoz, complained that Indian depredations continued despite the fact that every year the Spanish gave them, the Indians, lavish gifts in an attempt to bribe them into being peaceful. The Spanish wanted to use the Indians to stop encroachment of Americans into Texas, and that's certainly true after 1803 in the acquisition of Louisiana Purchase. But even before 1803, the Spanish attempted to develop routes of commerce and trade throughout Texas. The hope was that they could link Natchitoches, Louisiana, with San Antonio and Santa Fe, New Mexico. Pedro Vial traveled extensively in Texas in 1786 and 1787. The following year, the governor of New Mexico sent an expedition under Colonel Jose Mares, who traveled eastward to San Antonio. Vial, in 1788 and 1789, actually traveled from Santa Fe to Natchitoches to San Antonio and back to Santa Fe. The truth is that these and other movements of Spanish troops and personnel were an attempt to both impress the United States and the Comanches with the mobility and firepower of the Spanish military. But again, there weren't too many Spanish soldiers in Texas, and that was a problem. And the Spaniards had to defend themselves against encroachment because, for instance, in 1806, Zebulon Pike of the United States military led an expedition to the headwaters of the Rio Grande River, i.e. in what is today New Mexico, clearly in Spanish territory. These expeditions by the Spanish military impressed no one and really confirmed that there was no practical route from Santa Fe to San Antonio, and virtually there wasn't a practical route from Natchitoches to Santa Fe through the interior of North Texas. But once the United States purchased Louisiana from Napoleon in 1803 for $15 million, Spanish policy changed, and Spanish officials pledged to hold on to Texas at all costs, to maintain its ancient boundaries, to improve the Spanish garrisons, and to colonize Texas with Spanish subjects from the interior of New Spain, and to oppose any sort of Anglo-American filibustering military activity coming from the United States. The problem was that the Louisiana Purchase did not establish the western and southern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. And indeed, some people, including Thomas Jefferson, claimed the lands to the south and the west all the way to the Rio Grande River, which meant that Mr. Jefferson believed that he had actually purchased Texas. And some Americans believe that. The Spanish, as a result, the Spanish had to send additional troops into Texas to thwart U.S. efforts to explore the territory. For instance, the Thomas Freeman expedition from the United States went up the Red River and was stopped by Spanish troops in 1806, and we already noted that in the same year, 1806, Zebulon Pike was arrested on the upper waters of the Rio Grande River near Santa Fe, New Mexico. The U.S. sent troops to Louisiana, drove Spanish troops from Los Andes, and prepared for war. But in November of 1806, United States Army General James Wilkerson of Louisiana signed what was called the Neutral Ground Agreement with Spanish General Simon Herrera. The U.S. agreed to stay east of the old dividing line between Spain and Louisiana, and the Spanish agreed to remain west of the Sabine River until the governments could agree on a precise border for East Texas. the practical result was for the next 20, 30 years, neither side knew exactly what the boundary was, and a no man's land was developed that between the two lands that sort of outlaws operated freely in and out of without any supervision from the Spanish or the United States. Negotiations on the boundary discontinued in 1807 and resumed only in 1817. And by 1819, the Adams-Onis, sometimes called the Transcontinental Treaty, was signed between Mr. Adams, Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams of the United States, and Mr. Onis, the Spanish minister in Washington. That treaty, the Adams-Onis Treaty, ceded and gave over to Florida Florida to the United States of America. There were problems with Spanish Florida, the border between the United States, the state of Georgia, and within the United States, and Spanish Florida. And to prevent a potential war, Spain was willing to cede over and give authority to the United States over Florida. But in the Adams-Onis Treaty, in return for taking Florida, the United States had to forfeit all claims to Spanish Texas. And the boundary between Spanish Texas and the United States, Louisiana, was set at the Sabine and the Red Rivers. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, few Anglo-Americans entered Spanish Texas. Now, some were respectable citizens. William Barr, Peter Davenport traded fairly in East Texas with both the Indians and Spanish authorities, and they were welcomed by the Spaniards. A small group of Americans settled in present-day Red River County up at Jonesboro in 1815, and they lived in harmony with the Spanish because these Americans were not interested in being troublemakers. Spanish tolerance, however, did not extend to filibustering activity, and one such infamous filibusterer was Philip Nolan. Philip Nolan came to Texas with the permission of the Spanish authorities in 1791. Again, he had permission to come and round up wild horses, and on that first trip to Texas, he took back into the United States 1,300 wild mustangs. On a subsequent trip, authorized by New Spain, he rounded up over 2,000 mustangs. But when Philip Nolan returned in late 1800 without authorization from New Spain with 17 armed associates, the suspicious Spanish sent 100 Spanish troops to find and arrest Philip Nolan. In March the 22nd of 1801, near present-day Waco, the Spanish troops ran into Nolan's body of men, had a running gunfight. Philip Nolan was killed, and most of his men were imprisoned in Mexico. The last 9 survivors of Nolan's expedition cast dice to see who would die to satisfy a decree of the Spanish king. We only know that Philip Nolan by trade was a bookkeeper and a personal protege of General Louisiana U.S. General James Wilkinson, a man who was involved in all kinds of double dealing when it came to Texas. But at this point, we need to stop the chronology of Spanish Texas to talk about the outbreak of the Mexican Revolution. At Dolores, at Dolores, north of Mexico City, Priest Miguel Hidalgo, on September the 16th of 1810, called for the overthrow of Spanish authorities in independent Mexico. Hidalgo, at the head of an army, captured Guanajuato, then Guadalajara, then the province of Nueva Santander along the Rio Grande border. Then he captured Coahuila, marching with his soldiers before a emblem of or a symbol of the Virgin Mary. And initially, Spanish Texas declared for the Spanish king, that they were going to be loyal to the Spanish king. But soon with the revolution going on in the interior of what is today's Mexico, the Spanish in Texas grew indifferent. But then on January the 22nd of 1811, Juan Bautista de las Casas, a resident of San Antonio and a former Spanish Army officer, seized the Spanish general, Simon Herrera, Texas Governor Salcido, and other Spanish officials. De las Casas followers took Goliad and Nacogdoches, both in the name of Father Hidalgo and the revolution Hidalgo was leading in Mexico. However, on March the 2nd of 1811, loyalist supporters of the King of Spain, led by Erasmo Seguin of Texas, captured De las Casas, who was summarily executed in July of 1811. But Father Hidalgo had likewise been captured by Spanish troops in the interior of Mexico and put to death in March of 1811. But the Mexican Revolution, continued under the leadership of Father Morales. In Texas, very soon, a filibustering expedition came from the United States, led by Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara. Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara was born in Ravenna, now the Mexican city of Guerrero. He went to the United States, to New Orleans in 1811, seeking support for the Mexican revolutionists led by Hidalgo and Morales. He was not officially recognized by the United States government, but Gutierrez was nevertheless encouraged to filibuster and do some filibustering activity within Texas. Gutierrez didn't know anything about military, so he recruited Augustus Meiji, a United States Army officer who resigned his commission and took charge of this expedition into Texas. Gutierrez in political command, Meiji in military command. Meiji and Gutierrez with 100 revolutionists occupied Nacogdoches in mid-1812. In November, his army attacked La Bahia, but it was at La Bahia at Goliad where Meiji died, apparently of a self-inflicted gunshot. Apparently, he figured out that De Lara was not interested in a revolution for revolution's sake, but to make himself money and influence, and apparently Meiji committed suicide. When the Spanish at La Bahia withdrew to San Antonio, De Lara decided that he was going to attack San Antonio, but again, he was without a military leader, so he chose Samuel Kempner to lead the military advance to San Antonio. And after defeating 1,200 Spanish troops led by General Simon Herrera, loyalist general of Spain, the Revolutionary Army entered San Antonio in triumph on April the 1st of 1813. 5 days later, Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara declared that Texas was independent from Spanish control. On the 17th of April, he called for a centralized government, a dictatorial government operating powerfully at the national level, not a Republican representative government as many of the Anglos in his army had anticipated. But what Gutierrez de Lara did that really was the last straw is that he had executed General Simon Herrera, Texas Governor Salcido, and 12 other Spanish loyalist officials. And that offended many of the Anglos in his army. They replaced Gutierrez de Lara, sent him packing in exile back to the United States, and replaced him with Jose Antonio de Toledo, who promised that the government for Texas would be more independent and liberal-minded. Very soon, Spain would react to the taking of San Antonio. And in August of 1813, at the Medina River, um, outside of San Antonio, west of the city, a Spanish army of 1,830 loyalist troops, led by General Joaquin de Arredondo, attacks Toledo's forces and completely routs them at the Medina River. Every single Anglo soldier in the Toledo army captured by Joaquin de Arredondo's forces were executed on August the 18th, 1813. Arredondo then followed with a purge to drive every Anglo-American out of East Texas who he believed disloyal to Spain. And indeed, he believed all Anglo-Americans were disloyal to Spain. If they were captured, they were executed, properties confiscated that were abandoned, and if their wives and daughters and families were captured, the women were imprisoned to do work for the Loyalist Army. Texas, with the exception of San Antonio de Bexar, was completely depopulated, with no serious effort to populate Texas again until the mid-1820s. But more filibusters would occur. In 1818, the Spanish military even had to drive away 120 French colonists, Napoleonic sympathizers under Charles Lamond, who had settled on the Trinity River over in East Texas. And then in 1819 came the American James Long, a Natchez, Mississippi merchant who married General James Wilkinson's niece, Jane. James Long saw the Adams-Onis Treaty as a surrender of Texas by the United States of America. He had grand plans to drive the Spanish out of Texas and then to use land grants to attract Anglo settlers into Texas. Three men, i.e., James Long, the previously exiled Bernardo Gutierrez, and one other man arrived at Nacogdoches in May 23rd of 1819 to establish a civil government and to invite Anglo-Americans into Texas. In order to consolidate his holdings in East Texas, Long knew that soon the Spanish would militarily act against him, and he needed allies. And so Long left for Galveston to seek the aid of a completely unusual alleged ally, Jean Lafitte, the notorious pirate. Lafitte had held Galveston since April of 1817. Long visited with Lafitte for several days. He failed to convince Lafitte to join him. But while Long was visiting with Lafitte in Galveston, a Spanish force captured East Texas and routed his men back into the United States. So Long had to cross East Texas on overland, carefully avoiding being captured by Spanish authorities who would have shot him. He made his way back to New Orleans, gathered new men, and in 1821 came back to Texas, this time even with his family and his wife, Jane Long. Headquartering on Bolivar Point on Galveston Island, Long remained there for several months in an attempt to rally men to his cause. When his army finally got to the point of 50 armed men, he journeyed to La Bahia in October of 1821 to attack the Spanish mission, the Spanish fort there. He left behind at Bolivar Point his wife Jane, who was about to give birth, and one slave, and left at this fortification at Bolivar Point on Galveston Island. He left his wife and a slave and one small cannon that dutifully they fired every morning and every evening, warning the Indians of the area not to attack. And Jane Long gave birth there on Bolivar Point to the first Caucasian baby documented ever to have been born in Texas. And as a result, Jane Long is known as the mother of Texas. Apparently it didn't matter all those Hispanic babies being born in Texas. The first Anglo birth was Jane Long giving birth to Long's James Long's child. When her husband, marching on La Bahia, arrived and presented his forces to the commandant of the Presidio, the Spanish commander at La Bahia greeted him as a fellow revolutionist and acknowledged that to Long that Mexico had just won her independence, and he had learned that Mexico was now independent, and Long immediately left for Mexico City because he wanted to be involved in distribution of land in East Texas. And we know that about 6 months later, in 1822, in Mexico City, a Mexican soldier apparently by accident shot and killed James Long. He never saw his wife Jane or his baby ever again. Texas, however, conditions would soon change in Texas, even before the end of the Spanish involvement and control of New Spain. The ruling Cortes of Spain, the ruling council, in September of 1820, acknowledged that New Spain had decided to open all lands to foreigners who would simply respect the Spanish Constitution and monarchy. And among those Americans who suddenly said, wow, I'd like to move to Texas, and because I respect the Spanish Constitution and monarchy, was Moses Austin of Virginia and the former U.S. Missouri Territory. And soon, December 1820, Austin appeared before Texas Governor Antonio de Martinez in San Antonio, seeking an impresario contract to bring in 300 Anglo-American families into Texas who would live there peacefully. He had been an impresario once before for Spain, bringing Americans into the Spanish Missouri. In fact, Moses Austin is the father of Potosi, Missouri, the city of Potosi, Missouri today. And now he wanted to renew his his allegiance to New Spain. In truth, Moses Austin had been given land in Missouri. He had gone heavily into the silver mining business, and he had lost his shirt in the American economic panic of 1819. And so this is a way, impresario contract with Spanish Texas, that Moses Austin could recoup his wealth. And so he made his way to San Antonio and made a pitch to Governor Martinez to grant Moses Austin a impresario contract. The governor was not interested, and it was a downhearted, distressed Moses Austin that left the governor's palace on the square in San Antonio, feeling that his fortunes were lost. And downhearted, looking down at the ground, Moses Austin exited the governor's palace and looked up and looked into the face of a man who he had known years before in the Missouri Territory, the Baron de Bastrop. And luckily for him, the Baron de Bastrop said, you know what, I know the Governor Martinez, he's a friend of mine. Let me intercede for you because we've done business before in Missouri. I know, your good intentions. And within 2 weeks, Governor Martinez had said, you know what, I was a little hasty. I think we can fulfill an impresario contract with you. And even Spanish General Joaquin de Arredondo, the military commander who had executed Anglo-Americans at the Battle of the Medina back in 1813 or so, now said to Moses Austin, I think I favor Anglo-Americans coming peacefully into Texas. And so Moses Austin made his way back to the Missouri Territory, but he made one bad mistake. He fell into bad company with 2 fellow travelers. And up around the Red River, they rolled Moses Austin, beat him up, and left him for dead on the side of the road. Moses Austin was a tough old bird. He refused to die. He made his way back to the Missouri Territory and subsequently died. And it was left to his son, Stephen Fuller Austin, who was 27 years old, to fulfill Moses Austin's impresario contract. At this point, I think is a good stopping point, and I will see you around the block, and I will see you in the clouds, okay? And this is the third lecture, and we will continue in days to follow with additional lectures. Thank you, and have a good day.